Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our talk on the Partition of India. Now, an admin thing for the people who are watching on Zoom. We're going to have questions at the end of the talk. If you'd like to ask a question, would you click the Q&A button, please, at the bottom of your screen? And if you do, then you'll be able to type your question, which I'll be able to see and relay to John. Now, when we devise our program of talks, we start by looking for anniversaries. And if you look through our program, you'll see there are many anniversaries which we're celebrating. But it's 75 years, very close to 75 years, since the Partition of India. It's obviously a tragedy in so many ways. And could the tragedy have been avoided? So through mutual friends, I've known John Elliott for some time. He spent 25 years in India as a journalist. And he makes the point that he's a journalist rather than a historian. And he feels that he's going to give you a journalist's view of the conflict and hopefully, perhaps what could it have been avoided? Well, I think we're going to see if it could. John, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Hamish, and thank you for inviting me to come here to speak to you this afternoon. As Hamish said, I'm a journalist. I was in India for about 25 years, initially in the 80s, opening the Financial Times office, and then after some time in Hong Kong, I went back and wrote for the Economist and Fortune magazine and the New Statesman, but not the Spectator, and one or two other people, and I now do a blog called Riding the Elephant, which started on the Fortune website. I came back to London 3 years ago and still watch India very, very closely. So that's me. What if is usually a fairly pointless counterfactual game to play with history, because whatever's happened has happened, and we can't get into a time capsule and go back and change it. But one of the what ifs which persists is the partition of Pakistan from India in 1947. A tragedy in terms of the horrific loss of life and the unbelievable violence. 5 million people, maybe or more, displaced, moving home in tragic circumstances, and between 1 million and 2 million dead, probably nearer 2, and great tragedy. And because of the continuing conflict, of course, it's still another level of tragedy because of the fighting that goes on the border and because of the risk of war between these two nuclear powers. But for the partition, South Asia could be a great economic success, a great economic powerhouse. We're approaching 2 billion people, stretching from Pakistan Pakistan on the left, which is not shown on this map, across to what's now Bangladesh on the right, and from Nepal and Bhutan, which of course were never part of the British Empire, at the top down to Sri Lanka. That would now be a population of 1.8 billion people, which is much bigger than ASEAN, which is the economic link up in Southeast Asia, and much bigger than the 750 million in the European Union. I'm not sure whether that's pre-Brexit or post-Brexit, or whatever. 750 or 800 million, insignificant compared with the size of the 1.8 billion people in South Asia. And as a journalist, I've always wobbled between what crudely is called the conspiracy or the cock-up view of life. And I don't always go with conspiracies, but conspiracy theorists might suggest that the rest of the world, especially America, has conspired to make sure that there's not too much peace in that area, because they wouldn't want such a huge trading bloc of 1.8 billion people to emerge and change the balance of economic power, at least in the world. But partition did happen along religious lines to separate Hindu India from Muslim Pakistan, later split in two when Bangladesh broke away in 1971. And Pakistan and India's independence was declared on 2 consecutive days in August 1947, 75 years ago next year, which, as Hamish said, is why he's invited me here to speak today. But we do actually have a 75-year anniversary to mark, and that was May the 16th, 1946, 75 years ago last Sunday, when Viscount Addison, which I'm sure we've all heard, Viscount Addison, the Secretary of State for the Dominions, stood up in the House of Lords in London, and Lord Wavell, who was the Viceroy in India, stood up in India and announced what was the cabinet plan for the Dominion status for the whole of India, which would then have been split into, it would have sorted itself out into separate sections. And that was would have been a voluntary decision. There would not have been a hardline division on religious grounds, at least to begin with. And it might have been an ideal solution, but it didn't happen. And the failure of that promising federal plan led to partition and all the problems just 15 months later. What if, to stay with that theme, what if is still being debated in both countries, because neither is happy with what they've got. Pakistan feels itself incomplete without having the Valley of Kashmir. You can see Kashmir up there at the top of the map. The Valley of Jammu is the bottom half of it, it's not marked, and Kashmir proper is the top part and includes the Valley of Kashmir, which is the key sensitive area, Srinagar, the Srinagar Valley, if any of you have ever traveled there. Pakistan feels itself incomplete without having that valley, the Valley of Kashmir, in its territory. And its very being, ever since independence, has seemed focused on somehow getting it back into Pakistan. Kashmir is often said to be the unfinished agenda of partition, and indeed it is. Pakistan has failed to establish itself as a successful modern democracy and economy. It's focused on the army's rule and the desire to get the Valley of Kashmir back. India, on the other hand, although it's leaving the pandemic aside, is a well-established functioning democracy and economy. But it's dogged by the potential enemy of Pakistan on one side and of China, that's Tibet and further up, on the other, and it's squeezed between those two countries. But it seems rather like a divorce, where one partner, India, gets on with life and is successful, while the other, Pakistan, never manages to settle down and establish itself. And if you picture it like that, then you've got one successful and you've got the other one which is just not miserable, but in my analogy, miserable. And of course, later, Bangladesh, over on the right-hand side, half of Bengal, broke away from Pakistan. And Bangladesh doesn't have any of Pakistan's hang-ups. It's got no territorial or border ambitions. It is successful economically. It's got awful poverty, riven with floods and all sorts of disasters. But compared with Pakistan, it's a success. And it even beats in India on some economic things like the textiles, like the garments industry. These countries, especially India, are now suffering in new devastating wave of the pandemic. And I think it would be wrong for me to be standing here today talking about India and Pakistan without for a moment remembering and noting the tragedies that are going on there with suffering, chaos, misery, the collapse of government services, nearly 300,000 officially dead. The current figure is certainly more than that, it's probably nearer 1 million. And then there's the rest of the people who haven't yet died. We all know people. I was saying to Hamish earlier that I know 6 people who've died in the last 3 weeks, 3 friends and 3 contacts and colleagues. It's eating into society in a very deep way. And also in terms of figures, it puts the pandemic in the same realm of disaster as partition, with 1 to 2 million people killed, and the Bengal famine, of which I'll come on later, the 1943 Bengal famine, for which Winston Churchill is blamed, at least partially, about 2 to 3 million. So the pandemic is up there for India in one of the 3 great tragedies of the last 100 or so years. But back to partition, how did we get here? basically by the British. If I ever talked in India, I could always say the British. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to say when I'm in Haslemere. Us. But anyway, it's going to be the British. Basically, the British linking politics and religion with their favourites and their not so favourites, and by that being continued into independence and on to the present day. Though the Indian constitution says that it should not happen. Politics and religion should not be linked. Try telling that to Narendra Modi, the current Hindu nationalist Prime Minister of India. As Willie Dalrymple put it, Willie Dalrymple is a well-known author and historian, and he put it rather well in the New Yorker a few years ago. In the 19th century, India was a place where traditions, languages, and cultures cut across religious groupings, and where people did not define themselves primarily through their religious faith. A Sunni Muslim weaver from Bengal would have had far more in common in his language, his outlook, and his fondness for fish with one of his Hindu colleagues than he would with a Karachi Shia or a Pashtun Sufi from the northwest frontier, making the point that religion didn't matter way back, but then it came to and now to dominate. The British developed religion-based divisions with politics attached, and people started thinking in that way. A British South Asian origin scholar, Yasmin Khan, put it in her book, The Great Partition, that partition stands testament to the follies of empire, which ruptures community evolution, distorts historical trajectories, and forces violent state formation from societies that would otherwise have taken a different and unknowable path. So let's trace those follies. And follies they are, because though independence was inevitable, how it happened was not always intended. It was happenstance, a story of accidental plots and conspiracies that went wrong or succeeded, but it wasn't a clear-cut path. And then, so briefly into the history, demands were building up in the 1920s and 1930s for India to have some sort of autonomy. And this was sharpened after the massacre at Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar, when acting Brigadier General Reginald Dyer ordered the demonstrators should be killed, should be shot, and 379 were, in one of the most tragic and awful acts of intentional acts of independence. That sharpened the feeling the Brits have got to go. India then, I should explain, consisted of, there we are. One often thinks of India, oh, I'm not allowed to walk, am I? Saying hello to people on Zoom. One tends to think of India as being the whole of India in the empire, but it wasn't. The British India, before independence, is the purple or mauve or whatever colour that is, the United Provinces, the county states over there, Punjab, Sindh, and then this area down in the south. The green is all the princely states, the Maharajas, and in the Muslim areas, the Nazims. So that mix had to somehow be sorted out if India was going to have independence. I just wanted to set that up as a, there were 599, I've got it down quite a different figure in my notes. Let's say 600 princely states scattered all around those green areas. The biggest was Jammu and Kashmir in the north. The next biggest was Hyderabad in the south. And then there's a small one, which isn't shown here, in Gujarat. But there were all those green areas were the princely states. In 1935, the Government of India Act introduced the possibility of a federation of 11 provinces, which would be the mauve part, being given dominion status within the Commonwealth. And Britain was very determined, whatever India got, eventually it should stay within the Commonwealth. And the princely states could have an upper house if they wanted, which they didn't, and the idea didn't get anywhere. World War II increased the pressure from India for independence. The Quit India movement of civil disobedience was led by Mahatma Gandhi, was launched on August 8th, 1942. The next day, Gandhi, Nehru, and others were locked up, jailed, and eventually 60,000 to 100,000 people were kept in jail. Astonishing figures. I don't think we were very kind as colonizers. This left, important history, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the leader of the Muslim League, free to court Britain during the war. With Nehru and the others locked up, who were the Hindus, he was out there chatting everybody up and persuading the British that he actually mattered, which up to that point he hadn't had so much notice taken of him. After World War II, a Labour government won in 1945, as we all know, but it had a manifesto to give India independence. Clement Attlee, the Prime Minister, had been horrified by the conditions he'd seen when he went to India in the 20s, and he was determined that India should get independence. Important pressure was coming from America. Roosevelt had been pushing hard right through the war for Britain to say something to India that it would get independence after the war. America was firmly for ending colonies in general, and was also concerned, and this is quite amusing if you think about it in later years, was also concerned that empires should give way to self-governing, stable democracies as a bulwark against advancing communism. In India's case, the advancing communism from the Soviet Union up there and China up there. That's a policy, of course, that America then thought they would be able to do in the Middle East. Turn places into its turn and have some sort of change of power, put in a so-called democracy, and everything will be fine. It doesn't always work. In India's case, it's worked better than in most other areas. But anyway, there was heavy pressure from Roosevelt, and there was heavy pressure in India, and Attlee wanted it to happen. And also with post-war momentum, at the time after the war, there was energy to sort things out, to move ahead, to move on, to change things. And also the British economy was strapped, so they couldn't afford to support India. And also India expected to be rewarded for its role in 2 world wars. In World War I, there had been 1.3 million Indian troops serving alongside the British, mostly in Africa and Europe, but also elsewhere. 74,000 died. And it was called, and they got nothing at the end of the war. They thought they might get some sort of advance towards autonomy. It didn't happen. And it was in fact called India's Forgotten War, because we'd all forgotten about it until the 100th anniversary in 2014, when it was celebrated, commemorated in a way, but of course nothing was given. So then there was World War II, 2.5 million troops in the British Indian Army, mostly against the Japanese in Burma and Malaya, 87,000 killed. So they were saying, hey, come on, we've given you this, now give us independence. In 1946, Stafford Cripps led a mission, who was one of the ministers, led a mission to India, which was supposed to have reached some sort of agreed idea, but it didn't. So on May the 16th, 75 years ago last Sunday, the cabinet mission plan was proposed, which was going to set up as a dominions within the Commonwealth, a central union, which would have been fairly weak. It would have had controlled defense and foreign affairs and communications, but not all the other issues. So it would have had limited power. And then the states, the provinces, would have sorted themselves out with their own, with the rest of the powers, and the states would have been able to opt in with an upper house at the centre and join in what would have been a new free India within the Commonwealth as dominion status. But Nehru became Congress president in July 46, a few months later, and he said that an independent India would not be bound to accept anything which had been agreed before independence. So that idea faded. Now we move on to Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was supposed to have been the dreadful guy who rushed there and did it all too fast and led to disaster. Attlee announced on February the 20th, 1947, that Lord Wavell, who had been a good viceroy, since 1943, that's 4 years, was going. He was sacked. Attlee didn't like him, and Attlee wanted somebody who looked royal to go there and sort out partition, and because somebody with royal status would be able to deal with these blasted pompous Maharajas and the princes. Somebody needed to be able to chat to the princes and bring them on board when it all happened. And they felt that Mountbatten, or Attlee felt, Mountbatten was the right person to do that. Mountbatten knew of India a bit. He'd been the commander-in-chief, or was the commander-in-chief of that area, but he was based in Sri Lanka, so his knowledge actually was not that great. He's frequently blamed for rushing things through and thus leading to early partition and to the bloodshed. And in fact, he had insisted before he was announced, before he accepted the job, that Attlee would put a date on independence. I'm not going, he said, unless there is a date. I won't just go within this broad idea of sometime in the future. And so Attlee announced that the date would be not later than June the 1st, 1948. That was 18 months, 16 months ahead. The British government had already been talking to Wavell about April 1948, so that was broadly in line with what was thought to be a sensible scale of events. Mountbatten arrived on March the 22nd, 1947, and Alex von Tunzelmann, a British historian and author, in the book she wrote, in An Indian Summer, says that Mountbatten was quickly dispirited and wrote to Attlee, having just been there 10 days, and said, we need to act really quickly to avoid civil war. So after 10 days, Mountbatten had decided things needed to move ahead. The cabinet mission plan, this voluntary idea that I was talking about earlier, was still on the table, and Mountbatten had been told by Attlee to try and impose it. But Jinnah, the Muslim leader, was pushing for a hard split between Muslims and Hindu India, and that would not benefit with this plan. It seems that at this time, and this is an interesting point, that Jinnah and others envisaged that whatever happened, the borders between Pakistan and India would be soft, that people would be able to pass across, I suppose, as the best analogy, as they do in Europe now. How hard an idea that was, I don't know, but it would, of course, have been a much softer partition, because people wouldn't have felt they needed to rush across on the day when independence happened. Pausing for a moment, I should also mention that there have been suggestions that Britain wanted partition because it wanted to be able to have defense bases in Pakistan, assuming Nehru would not agree to them being in India. World War II, which is interesting, had shown that a country like Britain needed air bases around the world, in this case to service the Far East, as well as naval bases. So I leave the question open as to whether Britain was inclined to the idea of partition. What I suspect happened is that somebody in the Defence Ministry wrote a position paper saying, hey, if there is partition, it won't be too bad because we'll have these advantages. People would obviously, those sort of policy papers would be written, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a firm policy. The other concern, which is relevant now, was about the China-land border up there, the white area. And Britain wondered at this stage, whether the Indian Pakistan army might remain united. And obviously then Britain would have wanted some sort of influence. I mentioned these points because it illustrates, as we're getting very close, we're now a few months away, and there was such fluid attitudes, there was so little, it wasn't planned, it wasn't sorted out in advance. Attlee left it to Mountbatten to decide on the date, and Mountbatten addressed the nation over All India Radio on June the 3rd, 1947, 2.5 months after arriving, and announced that India would be given independence on August the 15th, 1947. That was just over 2 months later. Any longer wait, it was argued, would have led to civil strife, massive unrest. The thing had to be done. Under the plan, Britain would transfer power of the British Indian provinces to the Dominion of India and Pakistan, and they would remain within the British Commonwealth. And the 559, I've got it down this time, or 600 princely states would then be free to join, and this is important because we come back to it in a minute, either of the two dominions, with a third option of joining neither. You'll have all read or heard about the alleged affair between Mountbatten's wife, Edwina, and Nehru. Although that there was a relationship is absolutely no doubt. How far it advanced is anyone's guess. I do know, not firsthand, but secondhand, I know somebody who went into Nehru's bedroom around this time, and Edwina's photograph was on the bedside table. So you can all make your own judgments about who you put on your bedside table and whether that signifies anything. But that's, I mean, I know the person, in fact, I was with them a few months ago. I know the person who saw that. Various books report that in the first week that Mountbatten was in India, he was already flirting with Edwina, or perhaps one should say Edwina was already flirting with him. So while her husband was getting fed up and eventually after 10 days writing to Attlee saying, hey, God, we got to get out of here fast, his wife was having a lovely time. But those of you who read about all this won't be too surprised, because she had what, in the polite town like Haslemere, I will describe as an energetic life outside her marriage for years before this. So much so that Mountbatten wrote to her in 1927. This comes from Patrick French, who's another author and historian's book, Levity of Death. He wrote to her in 1927 saying, I wish I could drive a car like Bobby Castle Mountmorey, play the piano and talk culture like Peter, make enthusiastic remarks like Ralph, play golf like Ronnie, shoot like Daddy, I'm not sure what Daddy's doing in this list, shoot like Daddy, play polo like Jack. I wish I knew how to flirt with other women, and especially with my life, and that I could excite you more than I fear I do. Well, that was 1927, and we're now in 1946, so you can imagine the state of the marriage. So I think circumstantial evidence suggests that things must have happened. Did that lead to come to that, the serious point, did that lead to Mountbatten hurrying things up? I don't think so, because I don't think he would have decided in 10 days, hey, I've got to get out of here. Because being blunt about it, if his wife had been having a load of affairs, it wasn't going to matter much whether she had another one in India, although it was with Nehru. And maybe you could argue that that would be an advantage. So I don't buy the thought that, that Mountbatten speeded it up in order to get himself and his wife back to London. The worrying thing is that the August the 15th date was decided without the line of partition having been firmly fixed. So another famous name, Sir Cyril Radcliffe, arrived. Am I supposed to go forward? No, I'm not. I'm going to go back. Sir Cyril Radcliffe arrived to draw the what became the line of control between Bengal and the yellow line is the Radcliffe line. It says at the bottom. 1947. So on the right, you've got the line he drew in Bengal for Bangladesh, and on the left, you've got the line he drew for Pakistan. And people often think how awful that this guy turned up without knowing anything about India, and suddenly had to sit down with a few other bureaucrats, civil servants, and draw the map. But it wasn't quite like that. He didn't have a blank sheet of paper. Wavell had worked out the districts, which is how they finished up, back in February, and had sent that to Attlee, but Attlee wouldn't agree them. So Radcliffe came in to sort out the detail. So independence came, moving ahead. Independence came, and Nehru made his famous Tryst with Destiny speech. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom. Well, it didn't feel like that outside Parliament, where he was speaking. There was a bloodbath. Again, Willie Dalrymple puts it rather well in an article he wrote in the New Yorker. Millions of Muslims trekked to West and East Pakistan, the latter now known as Bangladesh, while millions of Hindus and Sikhs headed in the opposite direction. And that's the map of the movement. The arrows show the movement, the Muslims green and the Hindus and Sikhs red, and the stars are where the action happened. And I've chosen as the picture for this story a rather splendid painting by Krishan Khanna, who's a famous Indian artist, still painting in his 90s. He's one of the progressive group from Bombay in the 50s, along with famous names like M.F. Hussain and Sousa and Raza. And his family moved across on that night. There's lots of other pictures. You must have seen the photographs of the trains with people sitting on the roof and the deaths. And I thought I wouldn't do all that. I just had that as the symbol for today of partition. And Krishan Khanna wrote, "Someone came quietly at night and whispered that thugs were coming to murder and plunder in the morning. Ter Gulfachand sent to get the Tonga ready for departure. It was loaded with essentials, and then the family got in. 8-year-old Bajabai was hauled in, and then the journey began for the border, on reaching which they were stopped by the border guards, who told Ali, the Muslim, that if he ventured into India, they would shoot him. He told them to go ahead and shoot, but he would see this family across the border into India. They did not shoot, and then Tayaji bade Ali farewell and gave him the Tonga and the horse." That's a gentle story. Willie Dalrymple goes on to say, many of the thousands never made it. Communities that had coexisted for almost a millennium attacked each other in a terrifying outbreak of sectarian violence, with Hindus and Sikhs on one side and Muslims on the other, a mutual genocide as unexpected as it was unprecedented. In Bengal and Punjab, provinces abutting India's borders, the carnage was especially intense, with massacres, arson, forced conversions, mass abductions, and savage sexual violence. Some 75,000 women were raped, and many of them were then disfigured or dismembered. And the violence continued for weeks, at least into September. 5 million, and sometimes the figures much higher than that, abandoned their homes, and the figures for those killed are 200,000 to 2 million, which I mentioned earlier as being 1 million to 2 million. So now they had to deal with the princely states. And what they should do. Most of them were browbeaten or cajoled or persuaded or bought into lining up with the Dominion of India, leaving just 3, as I mentioned earlier. There's a place called Junagadh in Gujarat, which is not shown here, but it's up near Bawalpur, which was small, and the Nizam there thought that he would be clever and stay independent, but he was quickly persuaded not to. In Hyderabad, the Nizam there thought that he would form an independent territory, and Nehru sent the army in to annex it in September 47. That leaves Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, which is a huge story, and I'm not going to go into all the detail. It was the largest of the princely states, about 75% Muslim, but it had a Hindu Maharaja, Hari Singh, H-A-R-I, Hari Singh. He had dreams of creating a Switzerland in Asia, in Kashmir, which rather than joining either India or Pakistan, though he inclined towards India, he was close to Nehru, and that's what he eventually did. A pro-Congress Muslim party, political party, the National Conference, was formed under the leadership of Sheikh Abdullah, who became the chief minister, He was close to Nehru, and he later became, as I said, chief minister, as did his son Farooq and his grandson Omar, who was a chief minister a few years ago. India helped to arm some forces in Kashmir. Pakistan sent irregulars into the area. There were battles, and eventually the Maharaja signed up with India. And then, once he'd signed up with India, India could send troops in and grab and seize the place. And it wasn't until January 1949 that everything settled down with a UN brokered ceasefire, which was supposed to have led to a plebiscite, which has never happened. I mean, in questions, if anybody wants me to go into the detail of that, I can. Basically, the terms of the plebiscite were never accepted by either side, implemented by either side. Time passed, India had elections there in its side of Kashmir, and then said, hey, we're not going to have a plebiscite, which Pakistan continues to ask for. There were then three major wars. We've had one, 1947-48, an undeclared war. There was another one in 1965, when Pakistan infiltrated into Kashmir. And then there was another one in 1971 when Bangladesh was formed. There's seemingly endless conflict, combat on the LOC, the line of control. I should explain that line, disputed line, which is up in Kashmir, is called the line of control because it was never accepted. So the yellow does not continue up into Jammu and Kashmir. And there's constant combat there, firing across the border. There's bigger confrontations when Pakistan sends terrorists across into India to perform attacks, to mount attacks on either the parliament, or which happened once some years ago, or installations like airfields and barracks in Kashmir. Every Indian Prime Minister, and probably every Pakistan one too, has wanted to settle peace, but has been unable to do it. Coming to today, I might add on the other side of India, West Bengal and Bangladesh, as I mentioned, Bangladesh has got no territorial ambitions, and although there's some problems on the border, and there's problems with Myanmar and refugees from there, but there isn't anything like the conflict that there is in Pakistan. So there's stalemate on what to do about India and Pakistan, and it looks as though that will continue way into the future. So what if the idea in the 1930s of the cabinet plan or a federation had happened, maybe with the three regional groups? What if Lord Wavell, the Viceroy from 1943 to 1947, had not been replaced by Lord Mountbatten? Wavell was a much more gentle, slow character who might have been better at holding the fort and preventing the eventual eruptions. What if Kashmir, notably the Kashmir Valley with Srinagar, had gone to Pakistan? In a way, that would have been the most sensible. It's heresy for me to say this, having lived in India for 25 years. Don't think I'd get far to a dinner party in Delhi if I said, hey, wouldn't it have been great if Kashmir had stayed with Pakistan? And if I said it in anything like this, I would be tweeted now, and I would be hounded on Twitter for even dreaming of it. But in fact, from a logical point of view, if Kashmir had gone to Pakistan at the time of independence, there would not have been the conflict, which has continued to now, between the two countries. But it didn't, and as I say, we haven't got a time machine to go back. And finally, what if the soft borders that it seems the independence leaders assumed would happen had indeed done so, which they might have happened but for the Kashmir dispute? If any of those had somehow prevented partition or softened it with the earlier idea of negotiated dominion status, we'd have had that larger country of 1.8 million people, 1/3 Muslim. But that's not going to happen. And also the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty wouldn't have dominated politics in India, and the Pakistan army wouldn't have dominated politics in Pakistan. Might the best solution have been for the cabinet mission plan launched 75 years ago last Sunday for a federal structure? The centre would, though, have been very weak, controlling only defence, foreign affairs and communications, as I said, with limited financial powers. So it may not have been strong enough in the centre to hold the country together, and it may have broken apart. battles and divisions could also have been worse between the Muslims and the Hindus, because the Muslims would have such a 1/3 of the population is a big and sizable amount. There would also have been extensive unrest over who ruled the princely states, with the Congress and Muslim League parties wanting to get in there and oust the princes, and there probably would have been rebellions within. So there would have been problems in all those green areas. Maybe, though, we wouldn't have had a Narendra Modi and his Hindu nationalism, which I can talk about if people want to in questions, nor the ineffectual Nehru-Gandhi dynasty, which I just mentioned, but let's not bother with them in questions. They wouldn't be the problem they are today. But we've got what we've got. For better or worse, history is as it is.